The autumn wind swept through the muddy streets of Cedar Falls, Montana, carrying with it the bitter promise of winter. October rain had turned the main thoroughfare into a treacherous stretch of churned earth and standing water, where horses picked their way carefully between the deeper ruts left by wagon wheels. The year was 1884, and this small frontier town huddled against the coming cold like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Clara Mayfield stood on the wooden steps of the First Presbyterian Church, her worn leather valise clutched tightly in both hands. At 18 years old, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that should have drawn suitors from 3 counties over. Auburn hair that caught the pale sunlight, green eyes that held both intelligence and sorrow, and a delicate frame that spoke of genteel upbringing. But the slight swell beneath her faded blue dress told a different story, one that had closed every door in Cedar Falls to her. The church bells had finished their evening call to vespers, and the last of the congregants hurried past without meeting her eyes. Clara had been standing there for the better part of 2 hours, watching as families gathered their children close and quickened their steps when they spotted her. She knew what they whispered, that she was a fallen woman, a cautionary tale for their daughters. Someone to be pitied, perhaps, but certainly not helped. Reverend Morrison emerged from the church's heavy oak doors, his black coat flapping in the wind. He was a kind man, Clara knew, but kindness had its limits in a place where reputation meant everything and charity came with conditions attached. "Miss Mayfield," he said softly, adjusting his spectacles as he approached. "You're still here?" "Yes, sir." Clara's voice was steady, though her knuckles had gone white from gripping the valise handle. "I'm waiting." The Reverend's weathered face creased with concern. "Child, we've spoken to every family in the congregation. I've even written to the mission societies in Helena. But with your circumstances, it's proving difficult to find suitable placement." Clara lifted her chin slightly. She had heard variations of this conversation a dozen times in the past 3 weeks, ever since her father had ordered her from the family homestead with nothing but harsh words and the clothes on her back. Her mother hadn't even come out to say goodbye. "There's the Women's Refuge in Billings," Reverend Morrison continued, his voice gentle but insistent. "They have facilities for ladies in your condition, clean beds, regular meals, and they'll help you find work after I give up my baby," Clara finished quietly. "That's what you mean, isn't it, Reverend?" The older man's shoulders sagged. "Clara, you have to be practical. How can you provide for a child? You have no husband, no family willing to take you in, no means of support. The refuge offers a chance for both you and the child to have better lives. Apart from each other, sometimes that's the merciful choice." Clara looked down at her valise, seeing the small tear in the leather where her father had thrown it from the porch. Inside were her few remaining possessions, a change of clothes, her mother's silver brush, her school books, and the $23 she'd saved from helping with the church socials. Not much to build a life on, but it was hers. "I won't go to the refuge," she said finally. "This baby is mine, and I won't let anyone tell me I'm not fit to raise my own child." Reverend Morrison removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture Clara recognized as his way of buying time when faced with difficult situations. "Your determination is admirable, but winter's coming, and this isn't the kind of country that forgives the unprepared." As if to emphasize his point, a fresh gust of wind sent leaves skittering across the church steps and made Clara pull her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She knew he was right about the harsh realities ahead. Montana winters could kill the strong and well-prepared. What chance did a pregnant girl with nowhere to go have against the coming cold? but giving up felt like dying while still breathing. "I'll find a way," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The Reverend was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the fading light. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation. "Mrs. Morrison has prepared a room for you tonight, tomorrow. I'll make one more attempt to find a family willing to take you in. But after that—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. After that, she'd be on her own. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it. Even this small kindness was more than most had offered. As they walked toward the modest parsonage behind the church, Clara caught sight of her reflection in the church windows. The girl looking back at her seemed like a stranger, hollow-cheeked, eyes too large for her face, hands that trembled slightly from cold and fear. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life would unfold when she was 17 and thought herself in love with Samuel Barrett, the sweet-talking cowhand who'd promised her the world and then disappeared the moment she told him about the baby. But self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not anymore. Mrs. Morrison met them at the kitchen door with a bowl of warm stew and a look of carefully controlled sympathy. She was a practical woman who believed in Christian charity but also in the natural order of things, and Clara's situation challenged both her beliefs and her comfort. "You'll sleep in the small room upstairs," she said briskly, ladling the stew into a chipped ceramic bowl. "There's a wash basin and clean linens. We rise at 5 for morning prayers." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your kindness." Mrs. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I know this isn't what you wanted for yourself, child. None of us plan for our lives to take such turns. But perhaps this time will help you see that accepting help, real help, isn't the same as giving up." Clara nodded and accepted the stew, though her appetite had fled. She understood what Mrs. Morrison was suggesting. The same thing everyone suggested: surrender the baby, start fresh, pretend this chapter of her life had never happened. It was practical advice, perhaps even wise advice. But as she felt the small flutter of movement in her belly, the baby's first stirrings that she'd noticed just last week, Clara knew she couldn't follow it. This child was the only family she had left in the world, the only person who would ever be truly hers. Whatever came next, they would face it together, outside. The wind rattled the parsonage windows and carried the scent of coming snow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new rejections, perhaps the final closing of doors in Cedar Falls. But tonight, Clara Mayfield sat by a warm fire, protected from the elements, and allowed herself to imagine that somewhere in this vast, unforgiving territory, there might be someone who would see past her shame to the woman she was trying to become. It was a fragile hope, as delicate as the first frost that would soon silver the grass. But it was all she had, and she held onto it with everything she possessed. Morning came too soon, announced by the insistent clanging of Mrs. Morrison's kitchen bell. Clara had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with endless roads and slamming doors, and she woke with a heaviness that seemed to settle deeper into her bones with each passing day. The small room was cold despite the wool blanket, and frost had painted delicate patterns on the single window overlooking the church cemetery. She dressed quickly in her second dress, brown wool, practical and plain, and braided her hair into a simple plait. In the looking glass above the wash basin, her reflection showed the toll of sleepless nights and constant worry. But she pinched her cheeks to bring back some color and straightened her shoulders. Whatever today brought, she would face it with dignity. Downstairs, Mrs. Morrison was already preparing breakfast, her movements efficient and purposeful. Reverend Morrison has gone to speak with the Hendersons, she said without preamble, not looking up from the bacon she was frying. They lost their youngest to the fever last spring. Perhaps they might consider... Clara poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, grateful for its warmth. What did you tell them about me? The truth, that you're a good Christian girl who made a mistake and needs help? Mrs. Morrison's tone was matter-of-fact, but Clara caught the slight emphasis on the word mistake. It stung, even though she knew the woman meant well. And if they say no? Mrs. Morrison finally looked at her, and Clara saw a mixture of pity and resignation in her eyes. Then we'll have to consider other options. Clara sipped her coffee and said nothing. She knew what those other options were, and she'd already decided against them. If the Hendersons refused her, and she suspected they would, she'd have to leave Cedar Falls and try her luck elsewhere. Where? She didn't know. But sitting in this kitchen, feeling like a burden in a charity case, was slowly killing something inside her. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted her thoughts. Through the kitchen window, she saw a tall figure in a worn brown coat dismounting from a sturdy bay horse. The man moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with physical work. And when he turned toward the house, Clara caught sight of a weathered face beneath the brim of a black hat. "That's Eli Cartwright," Mrs. Morrison said, following Clara's gaze. "Owns the Triple Bar Ranch out in Willowbrook Valley. What's he doing here so early?" Clara had heard the name before. Cartwright was one of the more successful ranchers in the territory, though he kept to himself and rarely came to town except for supplies and business. She watched as he climbed the porch steps and knocked firmly on the front door. Mrs. Morrison wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer, leaving Clara alone in the kitchen. She could hear the low murmur of voices from the front hall but couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, Mrs. Morrison returned, her expression puzzled. "He's asking to speak with you," she said. "Says he heard about your situation and wants to talk." Clara felt her heart begin to race. In her experience, when men wanted to talk to girls in her condition, it rarely led to anything respectable. Did he say what about? No, but Eli Cartwright's not like some. He's a decent man, even if he is a bit peculiar. Lost his wife some years back and hasn't remarried. Keeps mostly to himself out at that ranch. Despite her misgivings, Clara was curious, and given her dwindling options, she couldn't afford to turn away any potential opportunity, no matter how unlikely. "I suppose I should hear what he has to say." She followed Mrs. Morrison to the front parlor, where Eli Cartwright stood with his hat in his hands, studying a framed photograph of the Morrison family. Up close, Clara could see he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-40s, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. But his face was kind, and when he looked at her, there was no judgment in his expression. "Miss Mayfield," he said, inclining his head slightly. "I'm Eli Cartwright. I hope you don't mind my coming by so early." "Not at all, Mr. Cartwright." Clara clasped her hands in front of her, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Mrs. Morrison says you wanted to speak with me." "I did." He glanced at Mrs. Morrison, who was hovering in the doorway with obvious curiosity. "Perhaps we could have a moment in private." Mrs. Morrison looked like she wanted to protest, but good manners won out. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything," she said reluctantly, and left them alone. Eli waited until her footsteps faded before speaking again. "Miss Mayfield, I'll be direct with you because I believe you deserve honesty. I heard about your circumstances from Tom Bradley at the general store. He mentioned you were looking for a family to take you in. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. The idea that her situation was being discussed by strangers was mortifying, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Yes, sir. That's true. I also heard that you've been having trouble finding anyone willing to help. Yes, sir. Eli moved to the window and looked out at the street, where early morning traffic was beginning to stir. I run a cattle ranch about 15 miles south of here. It's hard work, and the winters are long and cold. I've got a crew of 6 men, but no woman's touch about the place. Haven't had one since my wife died 4 years ago. Clara wasn't sure where this was leading, but she sensed it was important. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Cartwright. He turned back to her, and she was surprised by the directness of his gaze. I'm not looking for a wife, Miss Mayfield. I want to be clear about that from the start. But I am looking for someone to help run the household side of things, cooking, cleaning, maybe helping with the books. Someone who could use a safe place to live and raise a child. The words hung in the air between them, and Clara felt the room seem to tilt slightly. Was he actually offering her what she thought he was offering? You're saying you'd be willing to take me in, even knowing about the baby? Especially knowing about the baby. Eli's voice was steady, matter of fact. I know what it's like to want a family and not have one. I know what it's like to live in a house that echoes with emptiness. Maybe we could help each other. Clara sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. Mr. Cartwright, I don't know what to say. Why would you make such an offer to someone you don't even know? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer. Because 5 years ago, my wife and I tried to adopt a child through the church, but the families with children to place thought we lived too far from town, too isolated. They wanted their children in proper society. We were turned away again and again, until Margaret got sick and we had to give up trying. He paused, and Clara saw old pain flicker across his features. I know what it feels like to want something so badly and have every door slammed in your face. I won't pretend this would be easy. Ranch life is hard, and Willowbrook Valley can be lonely. But if you're willing to work and learn, you and your child would have a home for as long as you wanted it. Clara stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. It seemed too good to be true, which made her immediately suspicious. What would you expect in return? Honest work, help with the household, someone to talk to during the long winter evenings. He met her eyes directly. Nothing more than that, Miss Mayfield. I meant what I said about not looking for a wife. This would be a business arrangement, with room and board and a small wage in exchange for your help around the ranch. And the baby would be welcome. I've always believed a house should have the sound of children in it. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back hastily. After weeks of rejection and despair, this offer of simple acceptance felt almost overwhelming. But years of hard-learned caution made her hesitate. I'd want to continue my education, she said carefully. I was good in school before this happened. I don't want to stop learning. I've got plenty of books, and I could help you with numbers and such. I believe in education for women as much as men. And I'd want the right to leave if things didn't work out. Of course. This isn't indentured servitude, Miss Mayfield. It's an offer of partnership, nothing more. Clara looked at this stranger who was offering her everything she dared to hope for and more. She thought of the Hendersons, who probably wouldn't even consider her request. She thought of the women's refuge in Billings, where she'd be pressured to give up her child. She thought of the long winter ahead and the baby growing inside her who deserved better than uncertainty and shame. When would you want an answer? Take all the time you need, but if you're willing, I'd like to take you out to see the ranch today. Let you get a feel for what you'd be signing on for. Clara took a deep breath and made her decision. I'd like that very much, Mr. Cartwright. As she watched him put his hat back on and prepare to leave, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that didn't involve charity or compromise or giving up the child she already loved fiercely. It might be a risk, trusting her fate to a stranger. But sometimes, she reflected, strangers were kinder than family. The wagon ride to Willowbrook Valley took nearly 2 hours, winding through country that grew more rugged and isolated with each passing mile. Clara sat beside Eli Cartwright on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the landscape change from the familiar farmland around Cedar Falls to something wilder and more forbidding. The October sun climbed higher as they traveled, but it gave little warmth. The wind that swept down from the mountains carried the sharp bite of coming winter, and Clara pulled her thin shawl closer around her shoulders. She was grateful for the borrowed coat Mrs. Morrison had insisted she take, though it was too large and made her feel even smaller than usual. Eli had said little since they'd left town, concentrating on navigating the rough track that served as a road. But Clara was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the steady competence with which he handled the reins, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him without effort. "Tell me about the winters here," she said finally, needing to break the silence that had stretched between them. Eli glanced at her, then back at the road. "They're long. Snow usually starts in November and doesn't fully clear until April. The valley gets cut off from town for weeks at a time when the passes are blocked. That doesn't sound very encouraging. I'm not trying to encourage you, Miss Mayfield. I'm trying to be honest about what you'd be facing." His voice was matter-of-fact, without condescension. "If you came to live at the ranch, there'd be times when you wouldn't see another soul besides me and the hands for months. Some folks find that isolation harder to bear than the cold." Clara considered this, trying to imagine what such loneliness would feel like. But then she thought about the whispers and pointed stares she'd endured in Cedar Falls, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the weight of constant judgment. Perhaps isolation wouldn't be such a terrible thing. "What happened to your wife?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "No, it's a fair question." Eli's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Margaret died of mountain fever 4 years ago. We'd been trying to have children for 8 years, but it never happened. The doctor said the fever might have been easier for her to fight if she'd been stronger, but..." He trailed off, his jaw working slightly. "I'm sorry, that must have been very difficult. She was a good woman, deserved better than what life gave her." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "That's part of why I want to make this offer to you, Miss Mayfield. Margaret always said a house wasn't complete without children's voices in it. She would have liked the idea of giving a child a home." They crested a hill, and suddenly the valley spread out below them like a picture from a book. Rolling grassland stretched between protective ridges of pine-covered mountains, and a silver ribbon of creek wound through the center. Clara could see buildings clustered near the water, a large house, several barns, and smaller structures she couldn't identify from this distance. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and meant it. After weeks of feeling trapped in the confines of town, The openness of the valley was almost overwhelming. "It's God's country," Eli agreed. "Not easy country, but fair if you're willing to work with it instead of against it." As they descended into the valley, Clara could see cattle scattered across the grassland, dark shapes moving slowly in the distance. The creek sparkled in the sunlight, and she could hear the faint sound of water running over stones. Despite her apprehensions, she felt something in her chest loosen slightly. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, built of logs and stone with a wide front porch that looked out over the valley. It was clearly a working building rather than something built for show, but it had a solid, permanent look that spoke of care and pride. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Clara could see curtains in the windows. Several men emerged from the barn as they approached, and Clara felt her nervousness return. She'd grown accustomed to the way men looked at her since her condition had become obvious, some with pity, others with a kind of predatory interest that made her skin crawl. But these men simply touched their hats respectfully as Eli helped her down from the wagon. "Boys, this is Miss Mayfield," Eli said without fanfare. "She's considering helping out with the household." An older man with graying whiskers stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Frank Coleman, the foreman. Welcome to the Triple Bar." The others introduced themselves with similar courtesy. Jake Morrison, barely older than Clara herself. Henry Walsh, a weathered man who looked like he'd been born in the saddle, and the Martinez brothers, Carlos and Miguel, who spoke with accented English but whose smiles were warm and genuine. None of them stared at her condition or made her feel unwelcome. "I'll show you the house," Eli said, and led her up the front steps. The interior was clean but obviously lacked a woman's touch. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace and sturdy furniture that looked handmade. Everything was functional rather than decorative, and Clara could see places where dust had accumulated in corners and on surfaces. "Kitchen's through here," Eli said, leading her to a large room at the back of the house. It was well equipped with a cast-iron stove, a pump for water, and ample workspace. But like the rest of the house, it had the slightly neglected feel of a place where no one spent time unless absolutely necessary. "The men usually eat in the bunkhouse," Eli explained. "I've been taking most of my meals there too, since it's easier than cooking for one person." Clara examined the kitchen more closely, noting the good bones beneath the surface neglect. With some attention, it could be a warm, welcoming space. "You said you needed help with the books? Ranch accounts, correspondence with buyers, that sort of thing. Margaret used to handle all of that. I've been muddling through, but I'm not much good with paperwork." He showed her the small office off the main room, where ledgers and papers were stacked somewhat haphazardly on a desk. Clara ran her fingers over the leather-bound account books, remembering how much she'd enjoyed helping her father with similar work before their relationship had soured. "What about my room?" she asked. Eli led her upstairs, where a narrow hallway led to several bedrooms. He opened the door to a corner room that looked out over the valley. It was simply furnished but clean, with a comfortable-looking bed and a washstand. Most importantly, it had good light from 2 windows. "This would be yours," he said. "It's got morning sun and it's quiet. The baby's room could be right next door when the time comes." Clara walked to the window and looked out over the valley. In the distance, she could see the mountains rising like protective walls around this hidden pocket of peace. For the first time in weeks, she could imagine feeling safe. "Mr. Cartwright," she said slowly, not turning from the window. "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Why are you really doing this? A man in your position could find any number of women to help with household work." Why would you choose someone in my situation? She heard him move closer, but when she glanced back, he was still maintaining a respectful distance. Because I know what it's like to be rejected for circumstances beyond your control. Because I believe everyone deserves a chance to prove their worth. And because... He paused, looking out the window himself. Because Margaret always said that kindness was never wasted, even when it didn't seem to make much difference at the time. Clara studied his profile, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motives. But his face was open, honest, marked by grief but not bitter. This was a man who had suffered losses but hadn't let them harden his heart. The work would be hard, he continued. I won't lie about that. Winter on a ranch means long days and longer nights. There'd be times when you'd be cooking for 8 or 10 men when we bring in extra hands. There'd be emergencies, injuries, sick animals, equipment breakdowns. It's not the kind of life most young women dream of. What about the baby? When I can't work as much? We'll manage. Frank's wife lives in town, but she's helped out here before. And the other wives in the valley. There aren't many, but they're good women. They'd help when the time came. Clara turned away from the window and looked directly at him. And you truly expect nothing more than work from me? No. Other arrangements? Eli's face flushed slightly, but his voice remained steady. Miss Mayfield, I give you my word as a Christian gentleman that you would be under my protection here, nothing more. If anyone, including myself, ever made you feel otherwise, you'd be free to leave immediately with my help in finding other arrangements. Something in the way he said it convinced Clara of his sincerity. This was a man who understood what his word meant and wouldn't give it lightly. I'd want to send word to my family, she said quietly. Not that they'd care, but they should know where I am. Of course. And I'd want to attend church when possible. There's a small congregation in Willowbrook, about 5 miles south. We go when weather permits. Clara walked around the room once more, touching the furniture, imagining what it would be like to call this place home. It wasn't what she'd dreamed of as a girl. But dreams had a way of changing when faced with reality. Mr. Cartwright, she said finally, I accept your offer. Relief flickered across his features so quickly she almost missed it. I'm glad. We can work out the details on the way back to town. You'll want to gather your things and say your goodbyes. As they headed back downstairs, Clara felt a mixture of fear and anticipation unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She was committing herself to a life completely different from anything she'd known, trusting her future and her child's future to a man she'd met only hours before. But for the first time since her father had ordered her from his house, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than simply running away. And that, she thought, was worth almost any risk. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing the first serious snowfall to Willowbrook Valley 3 weeks after Clara had moved to the Triple Bar Ranch. She woke before dawn to the sound of wind howling around the corners of the house and ice pellets striking the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. When she pulled back the curtains, the world outside had transformed overnight into something alien and hostile. A landscape of drifting white that obliterated familiar landmarks and made the barn seem impossibly distant. Clara dressed quickly in the warmest clothes she owned, which still weren't adequate for Montana winter. Eli had mentioned getting her proper winter gear, but the baby had grown considerably in recent weeks, making it difficult to know what size clothing would fit. For now, she layered what she had and hoped it would suffice. Downstairs, she found Eli already dressed and pulling on heavy boots. His face was grim as he looked out at the storm. Bad one? She asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. Bad enough. We've got cattle scattered in the far pastures that need to be brought closer to shelter. The creek's likely to freeze over completely if this keeps up. He glanced at her, taking in her inadequate clothing. You stay inside today. Miss Mayfield. This isn't weather for anyone not used to it. But Clara had been at the ranch long enough to understand how much work needed to be done each day. Storm or no storm. The men would be out in this weather for hours, coming back frozen and exhausted. They'd need hot food and warm places to dry their clothes. What about breakfast for the hands? She asked. Eli paused in wrapping a muffler around his neck. They'll manage with what's in the bunkhouse. Don't worry about... Mr. Cartwright, Clara interrupted gently. You hired me to help with the household work. That includes making sure the men are fed properly, especially on days like this. She saw him start to protest, then stop. Over the past 3 weeks, they'd established a careful balance of authority and respect. Eli made the decisions about ranch operations, but Clara had gradually taken over most of the domestic responsibilities. It was an arrangement that worked well, though it required constant negotiation as they learned each other's boundaries. The path to the bunkhouse will be treacherous, he warned. Then someone will have to help me carry things over. But those men will work twice as hard and stay twice as warm if they start the day with a proper meal. Eli studied her for a moment, and Clara could see him weighing her determination against his protective instincts. Finally, he nodded. Frank can help you with the carrying, but you don't step foot outside without someone escorting you, understood? Understood. Within an hour, Clara had prepared enough breakfast for 8 hungry men. Bacon, eggs, flapjacks, and strong coffee that could wake the dead. Frank Coleman helped her transport everything to the bunkhouse through snow that was already knee-deep and still falling steadily. The bunkhouse was a long, low building with bunks along both walls and a pot-bellied stove at the center. When Clara entered with the first load of food, conversation stopped and several of the men started to rise. Don't get up, she said quickly. Just stay warm. I thought you might appreciate a hot breakfast before heading out into this weather. Jake Morrison, the youngest of the hands, grinned widely. Ma'am, you're an angel. We were looking at cold biscuits and whatever was left in the coffee pot. Well, now you're looking at fresh flapjacks and bacon, Clara replied, setting down the heavy tray. Eat up. From what Mr. Cartwright says, you'll need your strength today. As the men ate, Clara noticed how they kept glancing at her with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. She'd been at the ranch for 3 weeks, but she was still something of a mystery to them. They were unfailingly polite, but she could sense their uncertainty about how to treat a pregnant woman in their midst. Miss Clara, Carlos Martinez said in his careful English, you should not be out in this storm. It's too dangerous for ladies. I appreciate your concern, Carlos, but I'm not made of glass, and I certainly can't help anyone by staying locked up in the house. Henry Walsh, the most experienced of the hands, looked up from his breakfast. Begging your pardon, miss, but this ain't regular winter weather. This is the kind of storm that can turn deadly if you're not careful. Clara could see the genuine worry in their faces and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. These men, who barely knew her, were concerned for her safety. It was more consideration than she'd received from her own family. I promise I'll be careful, she said. But I also promise I'll make sure you all have hot food waiting when you come back. After breakfast, Clara returned to the main house and spent the morning preparing for the men's return. She kept soup simmering on the stove, baked fresh bread, and set up drying lines near the fireplace for wet clothes. The baby seemed to sense her activity and moved restlessly, making her more aware than usual of her changing body. By noon, the first group of men returned, stamping snow from their boots and stripping off ice-crusted outer garments. They looked like figures from a winter legend, faces red with cold, ice crystals clinging to their mustaches and eyebrows, steam rising from their bodies as they warmed up. "How did it go?" Clara asked, ladling hot soup into bowls. "Got most of the cattle moved to the closer pastures," Frank reported, accepting the soup gratefully. "But we lost track of about a dozen head in the storm. They might have taken shelter in the timber, or they might be scattered to hell and gone." "Language, Frank," Eli warned, entering behind the others. "Sorry, Miss Clara." Clara handed Eli a bowl of soup, noting how his hands shook slightly from the cold. "Any injuries?" "Nothing serious. Miguel took a tumble off his horse when it spooked, but he's just bruised." Eli warmed his hands around the bowl. "This soup might just save our lives. It's nothing fancy, just beef and vegetables. After 4 hours in that wind, fancy is the last thing we care about." The afternoon brought a brief lull in the storm, but the men's work was far from over. There were animals to tend, equipment to secure, and preparations to make in case the weather worsened. Clara kept busy in the house, but she found herself increasingly restless as the day wore on. She was folding laundry when she heard shouting from outside. Through the window, she could see men running toward the barn, their movements urgent. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and headed for the door. The scene that greeted her outside was chaotic. A young calf had somehow gotten separated from the herd and wandered into a drift near the creek. The snow was deep enough that the animal couldn't extract itself, and its struggles were only making the situation worse. "Can't get a rope on him from here," Jake was saying as Clara approached. "Snow's too deep to wade through safely." "We'll have to dig him out," Frank decided. "But it'll take time, and he's getting weaker." Clara studied the situation, her mind working quickly. The calf was perhaps 20 feet from solid ground, trapped in snow that looked to be chest deep. The men were right that it would be dangerous to try reaching him directly. "What about approaching from the other side?" she suggested. "The ground looks higher there, and the snow might not be as deep." The men turned to look at her in surprise, having not noticed her approach. Eli's expression immediately became concerned. "Miss Mayfield, you shouldn't be out here. This is dangerous work." "I'm not suggesting I do the work," Clara replied calmly. "I'm just offering an observation." Henry Walsh was already studying the terrain from Clara's suggested angle. "She might be onto something, boss. Snow does look shallower over there, and we could get closer to the little fellow." "It's worth trying," Eli decided. "But Miss Mayfield, you need to get back to the house. If that calf panics and someone gets hurt, we don't need to be worrying about you, too." Clara wanted to argue, but she could see the logic in his concern. She was also becoming increasingly aware of the cold seeping through her inadequate clothing. "I'll watch from the porch," she compromised, "from the safety of the house." Clara watched as the men carefully worked their way around to the spot she'd indicated. The snow was indeed shallower there, and Jake was able to get close enough to loop a rope around the calf's middle. With careful coordination, they managed to pull the frightened animal to safety. When the men returned to the house an hour later, they were exhausted, but triumphant. The calf was safe in the barn, and all the other animals had been accounted for. "Good thinking about the approach angle," Frank told Clara as she served them hot coffee. "Probably saved us an hour of digging." "Just common sense," Clara replied, but she felt a warm glow of satisfaction. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt like she'd contributed something beyond household chores. "Don't sell yourself short," Eli said quietly. appearing beside her as she worked at the stove. "You saw something the rest of us missed. That's worth something." Clara glanced up at him, surprised by the approval in his voice. "I've been watching how things work around here, trying to understand the rhythm of ranch life. And doing a fine job of it." Eli lowered his voice. "The men have been talking, you know. They're impressed with how you've settled in. Even though I'm—" Clara gestured vaguely at her expanding middle. "Especially because of that. They see a woman who doesn't let circumstances defeat her, who pulls her weight no matter what. That means something to men who work as hard as they do." As evening fell and the storm finally began to subside, Clara reflected on the day. It had been challenging, even frightening at times, but she'd felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with pity or charity. The men treated her with respect that was earned rather than given, and that made all the difference. Later, as she prepared for bed, Clara stood at her window looking out over the snow-covered valley. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by winter's power. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of work well done and a place well earned. The baby stirred within her as if responding to her thoughts, and Clara placed a hand on her belly. "We're going to be all right here," she whispered. "This is going to work." Outside, the wind had calmed to a whisper, and stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. For the first time since leaving Cedar Falls, Clara felt like she was exactly where she belonged. December came to Willowbrook Valley like a wolf in the night, silent, fierce, and unforgiving. The temperatures dropped so low that the creek froze solid for the first time in anyone's memory, and the snow lay 3 feet deep across most of the valley floor. Clara had grown accustomed to the rhythm of winter ranch life, but this particular morning brought challenges that tested everyone's endurance. She woke before dawn to the sound of something wrong, a restless lowing from the cattle that spoke of distress rather than the usual morning hunger. Through her frosted window, she could see nothing but white darkness, but the anxiety in the animals' voices was unmistakable. Downstairs, she found Eli already dressed and pulling on his heaviest coat. His face was grim in the lamplight. "Trouble?" she asked, wrapping her robe more tightly around her expanding form. At 6 months along, simple movements had become more deliberate, more carefully planned. "Water pipes to the main trough are frozen solid," Eli said, jamming his hat down over his ears. "Animals haven't had proper water since yesterday afternoon. We need to break the ice on the creek and haul water up in buckets until we can get the pipes thawed." Clara understood immediately what this meant. Hauling water from the creek to the barn in this weather would be back-breaking work, made dangerous by the ice and snow, and it would take every available hand working together. "What can I do to help?" Eli paused in his preparations and looked at her with concern. "Stay warm and safe. That's help enough." But Clara had been at the ranch long enough to understand that when crisis struck, everyone contributed however they could. "The men will be working in this cold for hours. They'll need hot food and plenty of it, and someone should prepare hot drinks to send out to them." "Miss Clara, you don't need to—" "Mr. Cartwright," she interrupted gently. "We've had this conversation before. I'm here to help, not to be a burden." Eli studied her face for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful on the stairs, and don't try to carry anything heavy." For the next several hours, Clara threw herself into supporting the water-hauling effort. She prepared enormous quantities of food, beef stew, fresh bread, and strong coffee that she kept hot on the stove every hour. She filled a large kettle with hot coffee and carried it as close to the worksite as she dared, where one of the hands would take it to the men working at the creek. It was on her fourth trip of the morning that disaster struck. The path from the house to the barn had been trampled down by constant foot traffic, but ice had formed underneath the packed snow, creating treacherous footing. Clara had made this journey successfully 3 times. Moving carefully with the heavy kettle, but familiarity bred carelessness. She was halfway to the barn when her foot hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. For a terrifying moment, she felt herself falling, the heavy kettle flying from her hands as she threw her arms out to break her fall. She landed hard on her side in the snow, the impact driving the breath from her lungs and sending sharp pain through her abdomen. For a moment, Clara lay still, afraid to move, afraid to assess the damage. The baby had been active that morning, but now she felt only stillness. Panic began to claw at her throat. "Miss Clara!" Jake Morrison's voice came from somewhere nearby, filled with alarm. "Miss Clara, are you hurt?" She tried to answer but couldn't catch her breath. The cold was already seeping through her clothes and the pain in her side was intensifying. When she finally managed to speak, her voice came out as barely a whisper. "The baby. I can't feel the baby moving." Jake was beside her in seconds, his young face pale with worry. "Don't try to move, Miss. I'm getting Mr. Cartwright right now." What followed was a blur of activity and growing fear. Eli appeared as if by magic, his face stricken when he saw her lying in the snow. He knelt beside her, his hands gentle but urgent as he assessed her condition. "Where does it hurt?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "My side, and Eli, I can't feel the baby. It was moving this morning, but now—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice her worst fear. Without hesitation, Eli scooped her up in his arms, snow and all. "Frank," he shouted toward the barn, "hitch up the sleigh. We're going to Dr. Henderson's." "Mr. Cartwright, Dr. Henderson's in town," Frank called back. "That's a 2-hour ride in this weather. Then we'd better leave now." The journey to Cedar Falls was the longest 2 hours of Clara's life. Eli drove the sleigh with grim determination while she lay bundled in blankets in the back, fighting waves of pain and trying desperately to feel some sign of movement from the baby. Frank had come along to help with the horses, and his presence was comforting, though no one spoke much during the terrifying ride. It wasn't until they were halfway to town that Clara felt it, a small, tentative flutter that made her gasp with relief. "What is it?" Eli called back immediately, hearing her sharp intake of breath. "The baby moved," she said, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I felt the baby move." She heard Eli let out a long breath. "Thank God." Dr. Henderson's office was a small, cluttered room above the pharmacy in Cedar Falls. The elderly physician had delivered half the babies in the territory and seen every kind of injury imaginable. When Eli carried Clara through his door, the doctor took one look at the situation and ushered them into his examination room. "Set her down here, Eli. Gently now." Dr. Henderson's voice was calm and professional, which helped ease some of Clara's panic. "Miss Mayfield, can you tell me exactly what happened?" Clara described the fall while the doctor examined her, his experienced hands checking for injuries. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, which made both Clara and Dr. Henderson smile. "Well, this little one certainly seems to be making his presence known," the doctor said. "That's a good sign. Can you sit up for me?" With Eli's help, Clara managed to sit upright. The pain in her side was subsiding to a dull ache, and the baby continued to move reassuringly. "I think you've bruised your ribs, but I don't believe anything is broken," Dr. Henderson concluded after a thorough examination. The baby seems to be fine. Good strong movement. Heartbeat sounds normal. But you've had a significant shock to your system, and that's not something to take lightly. What does that mean? Eli asked, his voice tight with concern. It means Miss Mayfield needs complete rest for at least a week. No heavy lifting, no long walks, no household chores that require standing for extended periods. The baby seems well protected, but we don't want to take any chances. Clara felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. So the baby is truly all right? As far as I can determine, yes. But Clara, the doctor's voice became more serious. You can't continue taking risks like this. I know ranch life is demanding, but you have to think about more than just yourself now. The ride back to the ranch was much more relaxed than the journey to town had been. Clara lay comfortably in the sleigh, wrapped in warm blankets, feeling the baby's regular movements and allowing herself to believe that everything would be all right. But it was during this peaceful journey that Eli chose to share something that changed everything between them. Miss Clara, he said quietly, not turning around from the driver's seat. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you before, but, well, I suppose I was afraid it might change your mind about staying. Clara felt a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with her recent accident. What is it? Eli was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. Margaret and I, we did have a child once, just once. She carried the baby for 7 months before we lost them both. The sleigh seemed to grow very quiet, with only the sound of the horses' hooves crunching through snow and the whisper of runners on the packed trail. I'm so sorry, Eli, Clara said softly. That must have been devastating. It was. And when I saw you lying in that snow today, when you said you couldn't feel the baby moving, for a moment, I thought I was going to lose another child, one that I'd come to think of as... He stopped himself, but Clara understood what he'd been about to say. You think of this baby as yours too, she said gently. I know I have no right to. The child isn't mine by blood, and you've made it clear that you can raise your child alone. But Clara, in these past months watching you prepare for this baby, seeing how much you already love this little one, I can't help but hope that maybe there's room in your life for an old rancher who never got the chance to be a father. Clara felt her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't romantic love. That wasn't what either of them was looking for. But it was something deeper and more enduring. The recognition of shared dreams, shared losses, and the possibility of healing together. Eli, she said carefully, are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd consider letting me adopt both of you, legally, permanently. His voice was steady, but she could hear the vulnerability beneath it. I'm asking if you'd let me be a father to your child and a family to you. Not a husband, I meant what I said about that, but family. Real family. Clara closed her eyes and felt the baby move within her, as if responding to the conversation. She thought about the months she'd spent at the ranch, the gradual building of trust and respect between herself and this good man. She thought about the way he'd dropped everything to get her medical care, the way he'd spoken about losing another child. Yes, she said simply. Yes. I'd like that very much. She heard Eli's sharp intake of breath, followed by a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. She couldn't tell which. Thank you, he said quietly. You don't know what that means to me. As the sleigh crested the hill that overlooked Willowbrook Valley, Clara saw the ranch buildings spread out below them, smoke rising from the chimneys into the crisp winter air. For the first time since leaving her parents' house, she was looking at a place that would truly be home. Not just shelter, not just employment, but home. And for the first time in her life, she was looking forward to sharing that home with someone who wanted both her and her child not out of duty or charity, but out of love. The blizzard struck on the last night of February, howling down from the mountains with a fury that rattled every window in the ranch house and sent snow swirling in drifts that reached nearly to the eaves. Clara had been feeling restless all day, unable to find a comfortable position as the baby seemed to press against every organ in her body. At 8.5 months along, simple tasks had become monumental efforts, but she'd attributed her discomfort to the approaching storm. It wasn't until the first sharp pain gripped her around midnight that she realized the baby had chosen the worst possible night to make its entrance into the world. Clara lay in her bed, timing the contractions by the ticking of the clock on her nightstand. The pain came in waves, starting as a dull ache and building to something that made her grip the bed sheets and bite her lip to keep from crying out. Outside, the wind shrieked like a living thing, and she could hear the house creaking under the assault. When the contractions were coming every 5 minutes, she knew she had to wake Eli. She wrapped her robe around her bulk and made her way carefully downstairs, one hand on the banister, the other pressed to her back where the pain seemed to originate. Eli's room was on the ground floor, a concession to practicality that had probably saved his life during the harsh winters. Clara knocked softly on his door, then again more urgently when another contraction doubled her over. "Mr. Cartwright? Eli? I need help." The door opened immediately, revealing Eli in his nightshirt with his hair standing on end. One look at Clara's face told him everything he needed to know. "The baby's coming," she gasped, leaning against the doorframe as another wave of pain washed over her. Eli was instantly alert, his mind racing through their options. "Mrs. Henderson, she's the closest midwife, but she's in Willowbrook, and in this storm." He looked toward the windows, where snow was battering the glass like thrown sand. "How far is that?" 5 miles. But the roads will be impassable. Even if we could get through, bringing her back in this weather would be suicide." Clara felt panic beginning to claw at her throat. "Then what do we do?" Eli's face was grim but determined. "We manage. Frank's wife Sarah has helped with births before. She's staying in the foreman's cabin tonight because of the storm. And Rosa Martinez knows about healing. She helped deliver half the babies in her village back in Mexico." Another contraction gripped Clara, stronger than the others, and she had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. When it passed, she found Eli watching her with deep concern. "How long have you been having pains?" "About an hour, maybe a little more." "First babies usually take their time," Eli said, though Clara could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Let me get dressed and fetch the women. Can you make it back upstairs?" Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. The pains were coming faster now, and each one seemed to steal her breath away. "I'll try." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and increasing urgency. Sarah Coleman arrived from the foreman's cabin, a sturdy woman in her 40s who took charge of the situation with calm efficiency. Rosa Martinez came from the bunkhouse where she'd been tending to one of the hands who'd taken ill, bringing with her a bag of herbs and remedies that smelled of earth and growing things. They established a command center in Clara's bedroom, boiling water on the stove that Eli had hauled upstairs, laying out clean linens, and preparing for what Rosa warned might be a long night's work. But the baby had other plans. "This little one is in a hurry," Sarah announced after examining Clara. "Much more of a hurry than most first babies. At this rate, you'll be holding your child before dawn." Clara tried to focus on Sarah's words, but the pains were coming so fast now that she could barely catch her breath between them. She found herself gripping Rosa's weathered hand, grateful for the older woman's quiet strength and soothing Spanish murmurs. "Is something wrong?" Clara managed to ask during a brief respite. "It feels like everything is happening too fast." "Sometimes babies just know when they want to be born," Rosa said in her careful English. "This little one, he does not want to wait for the storm to pass." Downstairs, Eli paced the kitchen like a caged animal, starting at every sound from above. He'd sent Frank back to the bunkhouse to keep the other men informed, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the house. Every cry of pain from Clara's room made him flinch. Memories of Margaret's difficult labor flooding back despite his efforts to push them away. It was just after 4 in the morning when Sarah's voice called down the stairs. "Mr. Cartwright, you'd better come up here." Eli took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering with fear. But when he reached Clara's room, he found her propped up against pillows, exhausted but smiling, with a small bundle cradled in her arms. "It's a boy," she said softly, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "A beautiful, perfect boy." Eli approached slowly, as if afraid the scene might dissolve if he moved too quickly. The baby was small but obviously healthy, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air as he let out lusty cries. "He's got strong lungs," Sarah observed with satisfaction. "That's always a good sign." Clara looked up at Eli, her eyes bright with tears and exhaustion. "Would you like to hold him?" With infinite care, Eli took the baby from Clara's arms. The child felt impossibly light and fragile, but there was undeniable strength in the way he gripped Eli's finger when it was offered. Looking down into that tiny face, Eli felt something shift inside his chest, a fierce protectiveness and love that he'd never expected to feel again. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to the world. I want to name him Jonah," Clara said quietly. "Jonah Eli Mayfield, if that's all right with you." Eli looked up at her, startled. "You want to give him my name? You've been more of a father to this baby than anyone else. It seems right." The baby chose that moment to open his eyes, dark blue like most newborns, and seemed to focus on Eli's face. It was probably just coincidence, but Eli felt as though the child was studying him, taking his measure. "Jonah Eli," he repeated softly. "I like that. I like that very much." Rosa and Sarah busied themselves with cleaning up, giving the new family privacy for these first precious moments. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, though snow still fell steadily. "Clara," Eli said carefully, "we need to talk about making this official, the adoption papers. I mean, for both of you." Clara shifted against her pillows, suddenly looking very young and vulnerable. "Are you sure? Now that he's here, now that he's real, are you sure you want to take on the responsibility of raising another man's child?" Eli looked down at the baby in his arms, then back at Clara. "This isn't another man's child anymore. This is Jonah. This is our son. And if you'll have me, I want to be his father in every way that matters. What about the legal aspects? I know you mentioned adoption before, but now that it's real, I've already spoken to Judge Morrison in Cedar Falls. He says the papers can be drawn up as soon as the weather clears. But Clara, I need you to understand what this means. If I adopt you both, you become my legal daughter, and Jonah becomes my legal son. It's not just for convenience or protection, it's permanent. It's family." Clara was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "I've been thinking about this for weeks, actually, about what family really means. My blood family cast me out when I needed them most, but you took me in when I had nowhere else to go. You've cared for me and protected me, and now you want to give my son your name." She looked up at Eli, and he could see the tears in her eyes. "If that's not family, I don't know what is. Yes, I want you to adopt us both. I want Jonah to grow up knowing he has a father who chose to love him." Eli felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Then as soon as the roads are clear, we'll go to town and make it official. Jonah Eli Cartwright. It has a good sound to it." "Cartwright," Clara repeated softly. "Clara Cartwright. I like the sound of that too." As if responding to the conversation, baby Jonah stirred in Eli's arms and let out a small cry. Clara reached for him, and Eli carefully transferred the infant back to his mother. "He's probably hungry," Clara said, adjusting her nightgown to nurse the baby. Sarah said that was normal, that he'd want to eat frequently at first. Eli watched in wonder as Jonah instinctively found what he was looking for and began to nurse contentedly. The sight of Clara caring for her child filled him with a profound sense of rightness. As if pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known were scattered were finally falling into place. "I should let you rest," he said softly. "You've had a long night." "We all have." "But Eli?" Clara looked up at him, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy. "Thank you for everything, for giving us a home, for being here tonight, for wanting to be Jonah's father. I know Margaret would have loved this baby." Eli felt his eyes sting with tears. "She would have. She always said children were the greatest blessing God could give. She would have been so happy to know that this house finally has the sound of a baby's cry in it." As he turned to leave, Clara called his name one more time. "Eli, I love you. Not in a romantic way, but as family. As the father I want for my son and the family I never thought I'd have again. I love you too, Clara. Both of you. Welcome to the family." Outside, dawn was beginning to break through the storm clouds, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. The wind had finally calmed, and in the distance, Eli could hear the cattle lowing peacefully in their shelters. It had been a night of storms and new beginnings, of pain transformed into joy, of strangers becoming family in the most fundamental way possible. As Eli made his way back to his own room, he couldn't stop smiling. Jonah Eli Cartwright had arrived, and with him, the completion of a family that none of them had dared to hope for. Spring came to Willowbrook Valley with the sudden violence of a Montana thaw. In the space of 3 days, the snow that had blanketed the ranch for months transformed into rushing streams that carved new channels through the pastures. The creek swelled to twice its normal size, and the air filled with the sound of running water and the first tentative songs of returning birds. For Clara, now officially Clara Cartwright as of the adoption papers signed just 2 weeks prior, the changing season represented more than just the end of winter. It marked the beginning of what she privately thought of as her real life. Life as part of a genuine family. Life as a mother to 5-month-old Jonah, and life as a woman who had found her place in the world through determination rather than luck. The baby had thrived during the harsh winter months, growing from the tiny infant born during the blizzard into a robust child with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Eli had taken to fatherhood with a natural ease that surprised even Clara, spending his evenings teaching Jonah to focus on objects and delighting in every small milestone. But it was the approaching cattle drive season that would bring the first real test of their new status in the broader community. "Town meetings next Wednesday," Eli announced over breakfast, balancing Jonah on his knee while the baby gurgled contentedly. Annual planning for the spring roundup and the drive to the railhead in Miles City. Clara looked up from the account book she'd been reviewing. In the months since taking over the ranch's financial management, she'd discovered a talent for numbers that surprised them both. Will they expect me to attend? They'll expect the head of the Cartwright household to attend. That's me. But I was hoping you might come along. Eli's voice was carefully neutral, but Clara could hear the underlying concern. The other ranchers need to meet you properly, and there'll be discussion about the cooperative arrangements for the drive. Clara understood what he wasn't saying. As a newly adopted daughter with an infant, she would be subject to scrutiny and judgment from the established families in the area. Her past would be known to some, suspected by others. And the legitimacy of their family arrangement would be silently evaluated by people whose good opinion could make the difference between acceptance and isolation. What about Jonah? Sarah Coleman has offered to watch him during the meeting. She's been wanting to spend more time with him anyway. Clara had grown fond of Frank Coleman's wife during the winter months. Sarah had become something of a mentor, teaching Clara the practical skills of ranch life while offering friendship without judgment. Her offer to help with Jonah felt like a gesture of support that Clara appreciated more than she could express. Then yes, I'd like to come. The journey to Cedar Falls the following Wednesday felt different from Clara's previous trips to town. Then, she'd been traveling as an unmarried woman seeking charity. Now, she rode beside Eli in the wagon as Clara Cartwright, member of a respected ranching family, mother to a legitimate child, and part of the economic and social fabric of the territory. But old insecurities died hard, and Clara found herself checking her appearance repeatedly as they approached the town limits. "You look fine," Eli said quietly, noticing her nervousness. "Better than fine. You look like exactly what you are, a capable woman who belongs here." The meeting was held in the back room of Peterson's General Store, a cramped space that managed to accommodate the dozen ranchers who comprise the area's cattle-raising elite. Clara recognized several faces from her previous life in Cedar Falls, including Thomas Henderson, whose family had refused to consider taking her in months earlier. When Eli entered with Clara at his side, conversation didn't exactly stop, but it definitely shifted. Eyes assessed her appearance, noted the quality of her dress, a new one that Eli had insisted on purchasing during their last trip to town, and took in the confident way she carried herself. "Gentlemen," Eli said without preamble, "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Clara Cartwright. Some of you may remember her from before her adoption, but I trust you'll welcome her as part of the Cartwright family." Clara was grateful for Eli's directness. Rather than allowing whispers and speculation to define the moment, he had presented her status as a settled fact requiring no explanation or apology. James Peterson, the store owner and unofficial leader of the group, stepped forward first. "Miss Cartwright, welcome to our planning committee. We're always glad to have the participation of ranch families." "Thank you. Mr. Peterson, I'm honored to be included." What followed was a detailed discussion of the logistics involved in moving several thousand cattle from the valley ranches to the railroad terminus 150 miles east. Clara listened carefully, taking notes when appropriate, asking questions that demonstrated her understanding of both the financial and practical aspects of the operation. It was when the conversation turned to the specific costs of the drive that Clara's preparation showed its value. "Based on last year's expenses," Peterson was saying, consulting a ledger, "we estimate the total cost at about $12 per head. That breaks down to roughly $400 per ranch for a standard herd size." Clara glanced at her own notes, frowning slightly. "Excuse me, Mr. Peterson, but are you including the new railroad fees in that calculation? I received notice last month that shipping rates have increased by 15%. The room fell silent. Peterson consulted his papers again, his expression growing concerned. I'm afraid I don't have information about any rate increase. Clara opened the leather portfolio she'd brought and extracted a letter. This arrived 3 weeks ago. I've been corresponding with the railroad's business office about our shipping arrangements. She passed the letter to Peterson, who read it with growing alarm. This changes everything, he muttered. If rates have increased by this much, we'll need to adjust our entire budget. For the next hour, Clara found herself at the center of the planning discussion. Her correspondence with the railroad and her detailed analysis of shipping costs proving invaluable to the group's preparation. Several of the ranchers who had initially seemed skeptical began asking her direct questions about various aspects of the business. Miss Cartwright, said William Hayes, owner of the largest spread in the valley, you seem to have a better grasp of the railroad's operations than most of us. Would you be willing to serve as our primary contact with their business office? Clara felt a flush of pride and accomplishment. I'd be happy to help however I can. When the meeting concluded 2 hours later, Clara had been appointed to handle all railroad correspondence for the cooperative, asked to review the proposed contracts with the livestock dealers in Miles City, and invited to accompany the drive as the group's business representative, a position that had never existed before but which everyone agreed was needed. As they walked back to their wagon, Eli was grinning broadly. I think that went well. Better than I expected, Clara admitted, though I'm not sure I'm qualified to handle all the responsibilities they've given me. You're more qualified than anyone else in that room. They recognized that, even if it took them a while to get past their preconceptions. The ride back to the ranch gave Clara time to reflect on how dramatically her life had changed. A year ago, she'd been a disgraced girl with no prospects and no future. Now, she was a respected member of the business community, a mother, and part of a family that valued her contributions. But the real test of her acceptance came the following Sunday, when they attended services at the small church in Willowbrook. The congregation was small, perhaps 30 people on a good day, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Clara had attended sporadically during the winter months, but always as an afterthought, someone to be politely tolerated rather than truly welcomed. This Sunday felt different from the moment they walked through the church doors. Clara, called out Martha Hayes, William's wife, approaching with genuine warmth. I heard about your appointment to handle the railroad business. How wonderful that we finally have someone with a head for such things. Other women approached with similar friendliness, and Clara found herself drawn into conversations about everything from Jonah's development to her opinions on various community matters. When Reverend Morrison asked her to read the scripture lesson, an honor typically reserved for established families, Clara felt the final barriers falling away. The sermon that day was about found families and the ways that God brought people together for purposes greater than they could understand individually. Clara caught Eli's eye during the message and saw her own thoughts reflected in his expression. After the service, the congregation gathered outside for their usual socializing. Clara found herself surrounded by women eager to admire Jonah, who was basking in the attention with his characteristic good humor. He looks just like his father, observed Mrs. Peterson, and Clara felt a moment of panic before realizing the woman was referring to Eli, not to Samuel Barrett. Those dark eyes and that stubborn chin. He's going to be quite the rancher someday. He certainly has strong opinions about everything, Clara laughed as Jonah fussed in her arms. Especially about feeding time. That's the Cartwright men for you, said Sarah Coleman with a knowing smile. They know what they want and they're not shy about asking for it. The easy acceptance, the casual assumption that Jonah was simply Eli's son and Clara was simply part of the Cartwright family, felt like a gift Clara had never dared to hope for. As they prepared to leave, Thomas Henderson approached them, the same man whose family had refused to help Clara in her hour of greatest need. Eli, Clara, he said somewhat stiffly, I wanted to congratulate you on the adoption. And Clara, I heard about your work with the railroad negotiations. Very impressive. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I hope you'll forgive me for saying this, but I think things worked out for the best. You found where you belong, and it's clear you're making the most of your opportunities. It wasn't exactly an apology, but Clara recognized it as Henderson's way of acknowledging that his family's earlier rejection had been short-sighted. She also recognized that his change in attitude had everything to do with her current status, and nothing to do with any change in his character. Thank you, she said simply. I feel very fortunate. As they drove home through the spring afternoon, Jonah sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms, Eli reached over and squeezed her free hand. How do you feel about all this? The acceptance, the responsibilities, the way people are treating you now? Clara considered the question carefully. Grateful, but also aware that their acceptance depends on my continued success. If I make mistakes with the railroad business, or if Jonah grows up to be a disappointment, or if I fail to maintain the standards they expect of a Cartwright, that acceptance could disappear quickly. Does that worry you? It makes me determined. I never want Jonah to feel the kind of rejection I experienced. I want him to grow up knowing he belongs somewhere, that he has a place in the world that can't be taken away. He will, Eli said firmly. We've built something real here. Clara. Not just appearances or social position, but genuine family. That's not something that can be taken away by gossip or changed circumstances. As they crested the hill overlooking their valley, Clara looked down at the ranch buildings that had become home. The cattle were scattered across the green pastures. The creek ran clear and swift with snowmelt, and smoke rose from the chimney of the house where she'd found safety, purpose, and family. She thought about the girl who had stood on the church steps in Cedar Falls 9 months ago, pregnant and desperate. That girl could never have imagined this life, this sense of belonging, this feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. But perhaps that was the nature of grace. It arrived in forms we couldn't predict, through doors we never thought to try, in the form of strangers who became family and homes that chose us as much as we chose them. 2 years had passed since that winter night when Jonah Eli Cartwright first announced his presence to the world, and Willowbrook Valley had never seemed more alive. The summer of 1887 had been generous with rain and sunshine, creating pastures so green they seemed to glow against the backdrop of the surrounding mountains. The cattle were fat and healthy. The ranch had expanded to include additional acreage purchased from a neighboring family heading back east, and the Triple Bar had become one of the most respected operations in the territory. Clara stood on the wide front porch of the ranch house, watching the late afternoon sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. At 20 years old, she bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had arrived here with nothing but a worn valise and desperate hope. Motherhood and ranch life had given her a quiet confidence that showed in the way she carried herself. The calm competence with which she managed both household and business affairs, and the easy authority she exercised over the domestic operations of a working ranch. "Mama! Mama! Look!" Jonah's excited voice drew her attention to the yard below, where her 2-year-old son was attempting to catch a butterfly that seemed determined to stay just beyond his reach. His dark hair gleamed in the sunlight, and his sturdy legs carried him in wobbling pursuit across the grass. Every few steps, he would stop and point at his quarry, chattering in the mix of real words and invented language that characterized his age. "I see it, sweetheart," Clara called down to him. "It's a beautiful butterfly." "Pretty," Jonah declared, giving up his chase and plopping down in the grass to examine a dandelion instead. "Pretty flower," Clara smiled, marveling as she did daily at the miracle of this little person who had become the center of their world. Jonah was a happy child, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and wanted, and his laughter filled the house with a joy that made even the hardest work seem light. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the main trail, where she could see a familiar figure riding toward the house. Eli was returning from his weekly trip to Cedar Falls, where he conducted business with the bank and collected mail and supplies. As he drew closer, Clara could see that he was smiling, which usually meant good news of some kind. "Papa!" Jonah abandoned his flower and ran toward the hitching post, his chubby legs moving as fast as they could carry him. Despite being only 2, he had already learned that Eli's return often meant small treats or interesting treasures from town. Eli dismounted and scooped his son up in his arms, spinning him around until Jonah squealed with delight. "How's my boy?" he asked, settling the child on his hip. "Have you been helping Mama today?" "Helped," Jonah announced proudly. "Helped Mama bake." This was a generous interpretation of his morning activities, which had consisted mainly of sitting on the kitchen floor playing with wooden spoons while Clara worked around him. But she appreciated his enthusiasm, and Eli's delighted reaction to the news. "Did you now? Well, I suppose that means you've earned a peppermint stick." Eli reached into his saddlebag and produced the promised treat, which Jonah accepted with the reverence due to such a rare treasure. Clara came down from the porch to join them, accepting Eli's kiss on her cheek, a gesture of familial affection that had become natural between them over the years. "How did things go in town?" "Very well. I have news, actually. Several pieces of news." Eli's eyes were bright with excitement. "But first, let me take care of Belle here, and then we can talk properly." While Eli tended to his horse, Clara took Jonah inside to wash the dust from his hands and face. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the aroma of the beef stew that had been simmering all day and the fresh bread cooling on the windowsill. It was a welcoming space that bore the unmistakable stamp of a woman's care. Checked curtains at the windows, fresh flowers in a ceramic pitcher on the table, and the kind of cleanliness that spoke of pride rather than mere necessity. Eli joined them a few minutes later, washing his hands at the pump and accepting the cup of coffee Clara offered him. Jonah had settled at the table with his peppermint stick, leaving sticky fingerprints on everything within reach but looking completely content. "So," Clara said, settling into her own chair, "what's this news?" Eli's smile widened. "Well, for starters, the railroad has approved our proposal for the new shipping arrangement. We'll have direct access to the loading facilities at Miles City, which should increase our profit margin by at least 20%. Clara felt a surge of satisfaction. She had spent weeks negotiating the details of this arrangement, corresponding with officials in territorial capitals and railroad headquarters, using the business skills she'd developed to secure better terms for the Valley ranchers. That's wonderful news. The other families will be thrilled. There's more. Judge Morrison pulled me aside after our meeting at the bank. It seems there's been talk in territorial government circles about statehood for Montana. If it happens, and he thinks it will, Probably within the next few years, there will be opportunities for people with business experience to get involved in the new state government. What kind of opportunities? Appointed positions, mostly. Territorial commissioners, business development advisors, that sort of thing. He mentioned your name specifically, Clara. Said your work with the railroad negotiations had impressed some important people. Clara felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. I'm not sure I'm qualified for government work. You're more qualified than most of the men who'll be seeking those positions. You understand business? You can negotiate with difficult people, and you've proven you can get results. Eli reached across the table and covered her hand with his. I think you should consider it seriously. Before Clara could respond, Jonah chose that moment to drop his peppermint stick on the floor, leading to a brief interlude of cleaning and consoling. But as she tended to her son, Clara found herself thinking about the possibilities Eli had described. 2 years ago, the idea of being considered for any kind of official position would have been laughable. Now, it seemed not just possible but natural. There was one more piece of news, Eli said when order had been restored. William Hayes stopped by the bank while I was there. He's received an offer on his ranch from a cattle syndicate back east. He's considering selling. This was significant news. The Hayes spread was the largest in the valley, and William had been talking about retirement for the past year. If he sold to outside interests, it could change the entire character of their community. What kind of offer? Substantial. More than the land is worth by any reasonable measure. But these syndicate operations don't operate the same way we do. They're interested in maximum short-term profit, not sustainable ranching. Clara understood the implications immediately. Large-scale operations often overgrazed the land, treated workers poorly, and showed little concern for the communities they operated in. The loss of the Hayes Ranch to such an operation could spell trouble for everyone in the valley. Is there any way to put together a counteroffer? Maybe with several of the local families investing together? That's exactly what I was thinking, and exactly why I think you should consider that government position. We're going to need people who understand both the business side and the political side of these issues, as if sensing the seriousness of the adult conversation. Jonah had grown sleepy, his head drooping as he fought to stay awake. Clara gathered him into her arms, feeling the solid weight of his small body against her chest. Let me put him down for his nap, and then we can talk more about all of this. Upstairs in the nursery, Clara settled Jonah in his crib, smoothing his dark hair and watching as his eyes drifted closed. The room was bright and cheerful, with painted animals on the walls and toys arranged neatly on low shelves. It was the room of a child who was wanted and loved, secure in his place in the world. Sleep well, little one, she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Tomorrow we'll catch more butterflies. When she returned to the kitchen, she found Eli sitting at the table with a stack of papers spread before him, business correspondence, bank statements, and what looked like legal documents. I've been thinking about our conversation, she said, settling back into her chair. About the government position and the Hayes situation. I think you're right that these issues are connected. How so? If Montana becomes a state, there will be new laws about land use, business regulation, railroad access, all the things that will determine whether places like this valley can maintain their character or whether they'll be taken over by outside interests. Having people in government who understand and care about ranching communities could make all the difference. Eli nodded thoughtfully. And you think you could be one of those people? Clara looked out the window toward the valley that had become home, toward the mountains that protected this pocket of peace and prosperity. She thought about the girl who had arrived here 2 years ago, frightened and desperate, and the woman she had become through the opportunities this place had given her. "I think I'd like to try, but not at the expense of what we've built here. This ranch, this family. That has to come first. It will. Government positions of the kind Judge Morrison was talking about don't require moving to the territorial capital. Most of the work can be done from here, with occasional travel for meetings and conferences." They spent the next hour discussing possibilities and plans, the conversation ranging from practical details about ranch management to larger questions about the future of the territory. As evening approached, Clara prepared supper while Eli completed his daily rounds, checking on the cattle and conferring with the hands about tomorrow's work. The routine was comfortable and familiar, but Clara found herself seeing it with new eyes. The life they had built here was good, better than she had ever dared to hope for during those dark days in Cedar Falls. But perhaps it was time to think about expanding their influence beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook Valley. After supper, as twilight settled over the ranch, the three of them sat on the front porch watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Jonah played quietly with a wooden horse Eli had carved for him, while the adults enjoyed the peaceful conclusion of another day. "Papa," Jonah said suddenly, looking up from his toy. "Home?" "Yes, son," Eli replied, lifting the boy onto his lap. "This is home." "Home," Jonah repeated with satisfaction, settling back against his father's chest. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. Such a simple word, but it contained everything that mattered: safety, love, belonging, the certainty of being exactly where you were meant to be. "Yes," she said softly, reaching over to stroke her son's hair. "This is home." As the evening deepened and the valley settled into peaceful quiet, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Family, she had learned, was not just about blood connections or legal arrangements. It was about choosing to love, choosing to stay, choosing to build something lasting together. The wind carried the scent of growing things across the valley, grass and wildflowers, the promise of good harvest, the eternal renewal of hope. In the distance, cattle lowed softly in their pastures, and the creek whispered its ancient song to the mountains. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be decisions to make about government positions and ranch acquisitions, about business deals and political possibilities. But tonight, Clara Cartwright sat on her own front porch with her husband and son, surrounded by the peace of Willowbrook Valley, and knew with absolute certainty that she was home. The girl who had once stood desperate on church steps could never have imagined this life. But the woman she had become understood that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as disasters, and the most unexpected doors led to the most beautiful destinations. As Jonah dozed in his father's arms and the stars emerged one by one in the Montana sky, Clara smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the grace that had led her here. To this place, to this family, to this life that was truly her own.